Hey everyone, my name is Leanne and today I'm going to be telling you about all of the books that I read in October. In October I participated in two readathons, the first of which was Victober, which was about reading more Victorian literature than you normally would, and this was a month-long readathon. I also participated in Mercedes' week-long autumn readathon, and I definitely wasn't as successful in either of these readathons as I initially hoped. And normally when that does happen to me, I end up feeling quite unmotivated and deflated and disappointed in myself. But this time around, I'm feeling pretty fine about not achieving everything I set out to achieve, because I realised that in readathons in the past, where I could have a really ambitious TBR, I didn't have a full-time job. And especially with the week of the autumn readathon, I was just in work so much. And in saying that, I still read quite a lot in October. Before we get into the readathons, I'm going to tell you about the books that I read from outside of those challenges. The first book I'm going to talk about today is Northern Lights by Philip Pullman, and this is the first book in the His Dark Materials series. A lot of people have been talking about this series because a new book in the world of this series has been released, and it is a release that people have been anticipating for several years. But to be perfectly honest with you, His Dark Materials only showed up on my radar about a year ago. I didn't read the series when I was younger, I don't have that childhood attachment to it. I basically knew nothing about this book other than people love it. So this book is about a girl named Lyra whose friend Roger disappears, and she goes off on a fantastical quest to try and find him. The journey to find her friend leads her to the north, where she encounters a number of fantastical terrors. She encounters armoured bears that rule the ice, and witch queens that fly through frozen skies. There are also a team of scientists that are doing some very horrible experiments. And as she goes on this journey, she discovers that something much larger is going on. I'm not completely enamored by this book. I didn't love it, but I'm definitely still going to continue on with the series because I feel like there's something definitely brewing beneath the surface, lots of things we don't know. Things that will start to make more sense as I read the later books. And I feel like there's going to be a lot of revelations which make the reader understand what was going on in the first book even more. So while I didn't absolutely love this first book in His Dark Materials, I think I'm definitely going to love the series overall. The next book I'm going to talk to you guys about is The End We Start From by Megan Hunter, and this is possibly one of my favourite book covers of the year, and I also really enjoyed the inside as well. The way this story is told is incredibly sparse. It's not quite verse, but it's by no means a traditional novel with prose. The only thing I can really think to compare it to is Grief is a Thing with Feathers by Max Porter. So this book is kind of presented as a dystopian story, but I do have some thoughts on the use of the word dystopian in relation to this book. But it follows the thoughts of a young woman as she is confronted by an ecological disaster which has led to the dystopian society, as well as dealing with her newfound motherhood. We follow her day-to-day thoughts about what her life has become as a result of both those monumental things. We see the ways that she struggles and the way that she strives, and I think she was a really interesting narrator to spend time with. A lot of people have criticised this book because of the sparseness of the story. We don't really learn exactly what's going on, and it is more snippets of thoughts than proper plotline. But I think that kind of worked in this story because it feels like she's just writing down her thoughts for herself. It doesn't really need the context because realistically the context wouldn't exist, if that makes sense. But I did want to talk a little bit about how the word dystopian is used around this book because people are going through these experiences all over the globe. An ecological disaster isn't something that has never happened before. It's something that is happening right now. People's lives are being destroyed by natural disasters. People are going through their first experiences of motherhood while their entire lives are being flipped upside down. But I think that's one of the interesting things about dystopia as a genre. It's a remarkably privileged thing to be able to see something as a dystopian book. The next book I want to talk about is A Franklin's Fine Bookshop by BookTube's very own Jen Campbell, and of course with illustrations done by Katie Harnett. This children's picture book is so beautiful, and I know I don't really need to sing its praises anymore than has already been done. Everyone is loving this book. This is about a dragon named Franklin who everyone is scared of. He really just wants to make some friends, but nobody wants to be his friend, until he comes across a little girl named Luna. and these two bond together over their love of reading and books. It is such a charming little story about the power and importance of reading, and I think children and adults alike would absolutely love this book. What I really appreciated about this was how Jen's poetic voice comes out in it as well. There are some really gorgeous uses of rhyme in here, and there are really interesting moments where a particular rhyme could have been very easily used, but it isn't. And there are moments where the rhyme is so incredibly subtle, but it just gives the story this beautiful rhythm. So yes, I would definitely recommend this one. Another book that I read in the month of October was Sunny Side Up, which is the 4.5 book in the Geek Girl series by Holly Smale. This is a short novella, much shorter than any of the other books in the Geek Girl series, that just gives us a small glimpse into what the main character, Harriet, is up to. As you may know, I absolutely love the Geek Girl series. I find it such a comfort read, but this book I enjoyed slightly less. I think because of the length of it, we didn't really get as in-depth into Harriet's relationships or character progression as I would like, and that is completely understandable. It is just a little extra book to add into the series. The only bit that I found really fascinating was the end of the book, where we hear from Harriet's ex-boyfriend Nick, his perspective. We hear the perspective of their first time meeting, which happens in the first book and kind of sets the series going. And I thought that was really interesting to see the same situation from a different perspective, but also see a really important character in the series from his own point of view. So we actually see how Nick is quite different to how Harriet presents him to be. And Harriet has always referenced the fact that she is an unreliable narrator. So that was one aspect of the book that I really enjoyed. The next book I read was Lincoln and the Bardo by George Saunders, and this won this year's Man Booker Prize. I was actually in the middle of reading it the day that the prize was announced. I'm not as in love with this book as a lot of people are. So this book is told in a really interesting way, and I really appreciate that, and I can understand why it won the Booker. So this book is about Abraham Lincoln and the death of his son and the grief that Lincoln goes through as a result of that. And why this book is told in such a fascinating way is because it combines both fiction and historical accounts. Throughout the book, there are snippets from historical texts that Saunders has obviously used in his research, and they are told as part of the storytelling. They're incorporated in that way. But we also have little snippets from ghosts that add the fictitious element to the story. This book is an exploration of grief. It is an exploration of the lines between historical fact and fiction. I think it would be a fascinating book to read if you are interested in the representation of historical figures in fiction. This book also has the backdrop of the Civil War as well, which was another really interesting element to it. So I think I more appreciated this novel than enjoyed it. I didn't really like it that much, but I understand why so many people have found it incredible. One thing I will say is that I started listening to this book on audio because it had this like really all-star cast, and I thought it would be really great. I would not recommend the audiobook at all. I stopped listening to it after maybe an hour because I just don't think this book works as an audiobook. So now I'm going to move on to telling you about the books that I read for Victober. The first book I read was Esther Waters by George Moore, and I buddy read this with Anne from Beyond the Pages, and it was a really great buddy read. I think we were definitely on the same page with our thoughts on this book throughout the buddy read, and I just really enjoyed reading this book alongside someone. I think buddy reading books is such a great process because it kind of forces you to really reflect on your thoughts after reading a passage rather than being quite passive about your reading. But I really enjoyed this book and was very pleasantly surprised by it. It is not a very widely read novel, and this book fulfilled the Victober challenge of reading a lesser known Victorian book. So this follows our protagonist Esther Waters throughout her life and career. It follows her romantic relationships, it follows her journey into motherhood, it follows her dealings with financial stability or lack thereof. And I thought it was really fascinating to see such a working class Victorian novel. And to see not only how the working class are depicted in Victorian fiction, but how the working class opinions of the upper class and vice versa were presented in Victorian fiction. I thought there were so many interesting, strong female relationships in this book. I was really impressed by the amount of female support that we found in this novel. There was one element of this novel that I think wasn't done as well as it could have been. This book also has a lot of criticism of horse racing and gambling and how that can destroy lives. And while I think that's a very valuable point, it was just less interesting to me than the other elements of this novel. And I feel like the author really hammered it home more than he needed to. Like, I think it was incredibly clear that he was criticising gambling and horse racing, and he just spent too much time talking about it. If you want to be pleasantly surprised by a Victorian book by a male author that has some awesome female friendships in it and a kick-ass protagonist, then I would definitely recommend this one. The next book that I read for Victober fulfilled the challenge of reading a book by a Welsh or Scottish or Irish author, and that was The Adventures of the Six Napoleons and Other Stories by Arthur Conan Doyle, who is a Scottish author. I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept of Sherlock Holmes and Watson solving mysteries and crimes, but it had been quite a while since I delved into any of the Sherlock stories. I read a few of these when I was a teenager, but I didn't really remember that many of them, and I feel like I have quite similar opinions now as I had on them then. I enjoyed reading them, I thought they were good, I thought they were very consumable, but that's kind of it. They didn't really leave me thinking for much longer. And while I'm sure it is fascinating to study the Sherlock Holmes stories as a series, as a set of stories, just reading them for pleasure was just kind of, it was good. It was just good. And there's nothing wrong with that. Something that was quite interesting in reading these stories was, since I read them as a teenager, I've watched a lot of Sherlock adaptations. And it was interesting to see the elements that have been in the TV adaptations and stuff in the actual stories. For the record, Elementary is the best Sherlock Holmes adaptation. The next book I'm going to talk about is Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu. And this bridged the gap between the two readathons for me, because both readathons had a read a spooky, supernatural kind of book challenge. I really enjoyed Carmilla. This is an early work of vampire fiction. It predates Dracula. And this is about a young woman named Laura who, at the age of 6, has this very strange dream where a beautiful woman is in her bedchamber. Flash forward 12 years later, and Laura comes across this very mysterious stranger who enters into her life quite significantly. And this young woman is called Carmilla. Laura and Carmilla spend so much time together. They become very quick, firm friends, but Laura isn't allowed to know basically anything about Carmilla's life or past. And Carmilla is also subject to very sudden mood changes. She can quickly become angry or upset. She becomes very quickly bothered by particular things like singing hymns. And she makes a number of romantic advances towards Laura. I won't say much more about the plot other than that because I think you should just experience it for yourself. Obviously, we kind of know the twist that is coming, and I think that can sometimes be the problem with classic novels, that they have so much entered the public consciousness that what would have been a plot twist in the past or an initial release is just something that people know. But I think knowing the truth about Carmilla's history doesn't detract in any way from the enjoyment of this novella, and it's fascinating to try and watch the other characters in this book work out Carmilla's history. And I think in that way it definitely stands up to the test of time in even better way than Dracula does. So I was very impressed with this one. For Victober, I also planned on reading Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but unfortunately in my busyness I didn't get around to reading it. I'm going to carry this on to my TBR for November, and I might pop it on my TBR for Tome Topple as well. The next book I read for the Autumn Readathon completed the challenge of reading a book with a young female protagonist. This was the only other challenge that I completed for the Autumn Readathon. I have started all the other books, but I have not finished them yet. But anyway, the book that I flew through for this one was The History of Wolves by Emily Fridland, and I devoured this book. This is the first time in such a long time that I sat down and read a proper full-length novel in one sitting. This is about a 14-year-old called Linda who lives on an ex-commune with her parents. At the start of this book, we spend a lot of time looking at Linda's school life and her interactions with a teacher who is later convicted of having child pornography. And later on in the book, we see how these interactions have really left a mark on Linda, and it's something that she comes back to think about quite a lot. And in this book, we also see her growing relationship with the family that move across the other side of the lake. She becomes a babysitter for the young child and forms a really strong friendship with the mother. But when the father returns home, things start to change. And Linda becomes aware that there are a lot of strange things going on, a lot of things that aren't quite right. And as the book progresses, we see a lot of strange religious beliefs and also a lot of parental neglect coming to the forefront. What I found really fascinating about this book was the way in which it is narrated, because although it is about the 14-year-old protagonist, it is told by her much older self, who is reflective of the events of her past. There are also scatterings of phrases like, "I would later be asked about this," or "this would come up in the court case." So you know something is going on and something's gonna happen. And I thought that narrative perspective was so fascinating. The idea of this 14-year-old perspective being filtered through an older, more knowledgeable, more aware narrator. I really, really loved this book. So they are all the books that I completed in October. I am in the middle of quite a few at the moment that are carried on from my autumn readathon selections. For my autumnal non-fiction, I'm about 3/4 of the way through the audiobook of Big Magic by Elizabeth Gilbert. I am around 90 pages through James Joyce's Dubliners, which was intended to complete the challenge of Read a Short Story collection. And I am a mere 85 pages into Burial Rites by Hannah Kent, which I selected to fulfill the challenges of reading a piece of historical fiction and a piece of fiction set in a cold country. I will tell you more about all of those in my November wrap-up. I read a lot of books that I wasn't too in love with this month, but there were a couple that I really enjoyed, especially The History of Wolves, by far my favourite book that I've read this month. If you have thoughts on any of the books that I have mentioned, do leave your thoughts down below and we can have a little chat in the comments. I hope you're having a wonderful day and I will talk to you guys in my next video.